So the first thing to put in perspective is that sex workers, we're almost mythological creatures, right? Everyone knows about sex workers. Everyone has seen a million movies, has heard about sex work, and it becomes the kind of thing that without any evidence, people have a sense that they really understand our community, the language and culture of our community. And so it's very hard for us to counter that. If you couple that with the fact that most of us are forced to hide, right? We're still criminalized, we can lose our kids, we can be evicted, we can be deported. We need collective stories and narratives out there. We've decided as a community that our individual stories end up doing more harm than good. They get used against us, first and foremost, right? So many sex workers have bravely told their stories of things they've experienced. They've pleaded with the public, with the government, describing violence that's happening to them. And the response has not been to listen to the conclusion, which is decriminalize sex work or give me rights in some way, but they've used our stories of violence as justification for further criminalization. The idea that an organization fully run by sex workers could exist for 30 years, be funded, employ, anywhere from 10 to 15 people, depending on the year, and provide services and continue to do advocacy is pretty rare because that type of funding is no longer available for new organizations that come up. We were very lucky to be created in the 90s where there was a wave of new funds available. So we're very grateful to still be here 30 years later. Before I start, I'm just going to mention that there's an exhibit about our 30 years that will open at the MEM, the new museum that they built all around Café Clio, like the new space there. So from October 21st all the way until sometime in March, you'll be able to go see content about the 30 years of Stella's history. So I encourage you to check it out if you're into going into those spaces. It's going to be the free portion of the museum, so you don't have to give any money to the city to see it. I assume if you're here, you probably already have some sort of solidarity with sex workers. And you probably already know that sex workers are criminalized and that we're the target of a lot of police repression, a lot of social repression as well, that there's a lot of stigma attached to sex work and a lot of intersections between hatred of sex workers and the protection of women and sex workers as an excuse for all kinds of other criminalization, such as Black communities that are targeted under the guise of, all Black men must be potential pimps, Asian communities, migrant communities that are targeted under the guise of human trafficking. So a lot of police violence and oppression comes from this decision that the governments made, at various points in history to use sex work as a tool of oppression of women and other communities. So it's not just about us and the criminalization that we face, it's also about where that fits into all landscape of policing and repression. So the things that we're fighting for as a community are pretty basic. We're fighting for workers' rights. We're a workers' rights movement. Obviously, the fact that our work is criminalized means that a lot of that doesn't look like traditional union organizing or other types of labor movements because the barrier that we face before all of that is obviously criminalization. So Stella, as I mentioned, we do services and advocacy. So our mission is really clear. It's to improve the working conditions and living conditions of sex workers. So a big part of our work is outreach that we do with sex workers all across the island, on the street, in massage parlors, in strip clubs, in agencies, at home, wherever sex work happens, we try to be in touch with as many sex workers as possible. And then we also advocate collectively for our rights in various venues. So today we'll be talking a bit about our methodology, our approach, our philosophy behind how we organize, and maybe how that's different from how a lot of other groups organize, and hopefully we'll be able to talk about that and interact on these topics. So before I launch into what narratives and messages we like to put out there, I want to make a little point about human trafficking, because it's becoming an increasing issue in our communities, and especially somehow with our allied communities, that this narrative of human trafficking or sex trafficking is really capturing people's imagination. And we hear all the time people who are supposed to be allies of sex workers who go on and on about Jeffrey Epstein and the sex traffickers, and the underage girls, and it comes up all the time in all kinds of places. And so I think it's a good venue to just remind everyone that the concept of human trafficking is a racist, colonial, hyper-problematic idea that was invented first and foremost to control immigration, to control people moving across borders, and women specifically, to have a justification to deport people and to target certain communities. And in the past 20 years or so, when anti-sex work movements lost a lot of their power, because the average person doesn't really think that like all sex work is horrible necessarily, well, they started building this narrative that we're trafficked, and that the repression that's happening is not about going after sex workers, it's about saving these victims of trafficking. And so we're the same community, the sex workers, the victims of trafficking, we're all the same people. We don't use that language, we reject it entirely, and anytime you see that language being used, even if there's real violence behind it, that violence is being used against us. No one who's supporting women experiencing all kinds of violence in the sex industry is using the language of trafficking. So if you see that around, don't use it. Find other words. Describe the violence. A lot of times that's a lot easier and it's more accurate, right? Because under trafficking, you put everything. You know, you're a victim of domestic violence. If you're a sex worker, well, he's a pimp and you're trafficked. You're working and you're 16 years old. Doesn't matter if you like ran away from a horrible home and you're just trying to survive on the street. You're trafficked. If you're underage, it's trafficking. You know, we can't accept that that's something that we have to contend with. It's hard enough to deal with police doing this, to deal with anti-sex work people doing this. We don't need our allies to be also joining in the excitement of trafficking. So moving on from there, I'm going to be talking about how we control our narratives as a collective and how that's different from other approaches. I'm not saying that Stella has like the one perfect way of managing this. I'm just going to talk about what we've decided to do. So I don't want anything to take it personally if we're saying that we're doing the complete opposite of what you might be doing personally or in your community. So the first thing to put in perspective is that sex workers, we're almost mythological creatures, right? Everyone knows about sex workers. Everyone has seen a million movies, has heard about sex work, and it becomes the kind of thing that without any evidence, people have a sense that they really understand our community, the language and culture of our community, and so it's very hard for us to counter that. If you couple that with the fact that most of us are forced to hide, right? We're still criminalized, we can lose our kids, we can be evicted, we can be deported. We need collective stories and narratives out there. We've decided as a community that our individual stories end up doing more harm than good. They get used against us, first and foremost, right? So many sex workers have bravely told their stories of things they've experienced. They've pleaded with the public, with the government, describing violence that's happening to them, and the response has not been to listen to the conclusion, which is decriminalize sex work or give me rights in some way, but they've used our stories of violence as justification for further criminalization. We see it all the time, right? Someone will tell a story, a prohibitionist will be recycling that story as evidence that we need more repression. So that's one of the reasons why it doesn't work for us to tell those stories. And then also, those of us who are able to tell our stories might not be representative of all of sex workers, might also fall into some traps, right? It's a lot easier to tell your story when you're like out of it and when there's a redemption arc or something like that. And we see it a lot, for example, with people who use drugs, where the stories that we hear over and over are people who somehow stop using drugs. And those are great stories, we need to hear them, but that tends to create more stigma for those that are not stopping, for those that are still using. So as a community, we've made this decision that we will instead be talking about collective narratives. One of the drawbacks of that is that it's hard to compete with, traumatic stories and violence and sensational stories when we're talking about really boring stuff about our rights and about our collective needs. But it's the way that we can sustain doing this for 30 years, that we can have people who've worked at Stella for 20 years, that I've been there for 10 years, and that I'm not here burnt out. Imagine if every time I came out, I had to tell you all about like the rapes and the attempted murders, and that it was my own feelings, my own experience that was always at the front. That's an act of violence that we're creating for ourselves when we're forcing ourselves to tell these stories all the time, and that we're making them our legitimacy. We're not legitimate because we have these personal stories. The personal stories, the personal experience is the starting point where we all come together, but it doesn't end there. We can't have an organization where whoever's at the table one day is who's controlling the narrative. So the process of putting forward collective stories means analyzing the needs of our community, listening to what's going on, and really taking the time to put everything that we're going to put out in the public through, some serious questions. Does this represent all sex workers? Is this harming any part of our community? Is this a message that is in line with our values and everything else that we're trying to do? So there's some things that we can't take on when we want to make sure we're representing everyone, but it ensures that we're not distorting the message and that we're hopefully not harming any sex workers in our community. And we also think that we don't owe anyone emotion, and we certainly don't owe anyone the process of humanizing us. I think that's very important when we're trying to organize collectively. There's always an instinct to think, well, people hate us, society hates us, the government hates us. If only they see me as a human, they will stop hating me. And that's a big fallacy that I have never seen that actually work in action. When we get rights, it's not because we've made people cry. It's because we've somehow found a breach in the system that allows change to happen. This is something that whenever we work with other organizations, sometimes it's a big clash, right? We know that going into classrooms and telling the story about how you got HIV and how you got treatment and how you're better is a thing that people have been doing, right? Same for all kinds of other elements of our experiences. And we found that there's something really powerful that we experience as individuals when we get to speak for the collective without having to prove ourselves personally, without having to pull from our own trauma, and in a way that we feel is accountable to other people. So this is the approach that we put forward. And I think we encourage other people to also consider whether that's something to experiment with that might make activism and organizing less exhausting, less of a burnout situation, and less exploitative of our communities. Sorry, just looking at my notes. So some of the things that we do to develop that collective narrative include, obviously considering always who's most affected by something, who's actually targeted, and who's absent. A lot of times it's the same people, right? And I think we all know that when we're in a situation where we're struggling to survive every day, we're struggling to not be deported, to not go to jail, to get through the day without any harm happening to us, those are not the moments in our lives where we are activists. Those are not the moments where we have this time and energy to feel community around us and to connect with other people. In those moments, we tend to be, for sex workers at least, in competition with other people. We tend to be, those are the moments where we have to use violence as a tool to get through our survival. It's not always compatible with organizing. And then when we come at a point where we're ready to organize, maybe we have more distance from those experiences. So it has to be a really voluntary and conscious step in our process to be having that analysis, to be thinking about who's not there, to be thinking, if I'm going to say something to the media, if I'm going to write something in a memoir for the government, if I'm going to put out a document, can I go down to the crack house? Can I go down to prison and say that exactly as is to the women there? Will they yell at me or will they agree with what I'm saying? And that's a step that we're missing sometimes, and it's how we end up with a lot of activism. And we've seen it a lot in our movement to defund the police, that there's easy ways that we can sort of get sidetracked. The common one is stuff like profiling. That we'll end up in situations where we're talking about racial and social profiling while pretending that we're not actually criminals, that we're not doing the crimes that they're accusing us. And so then it becomes what we're defending, the innocent victims of profiling. Yeah, sure, important. I really care about the fact that people who are not sex workers are getting harassed by police. That's really horrible, and they're probably not equipped to deal with it, and it's super traumatic. But ultimately, the people that are most affected by policing are the people doing the crime. And so it's really important to consider that, yeah, maybe your drug dealer is not at the table when you're talking about drug policy, but that doesn't mean that your arguments need to only be about drug users because they happen to be there. So all of this, to us, is how we're accountable to sex workers. Sometimes it works very well, sometimes it doesn't. We're a community that's very diverse, and like any other community that's criminalized, we don't necessarily come together naturally. Strippers and street-based sex workers are not friends in real life, right? This idea that we're a community is not actually true. And so I think sometimes it's important to also face that reality and to recognize that a lot of these groups only exist through criminalization, only exist through oppression and through stigma. That we end up being this one category of people that are together politically, but that doesn't mean that we're building community together, it doesn't mean that we have the same priorities. And so when we're very clear about that, it's a lot easier to find the common messages and to set aside the stuff that's not the fight that we need to do collectively. And those are fights that people can do differently, right? There's nothing stopping strippers from going off and doing, something about strippers' rights that doesn't necessarily affect other sex workers. But Stella, as an organization that's meant to be accountable to everyone, then we wouldn't be necessarily taking that on. So before I move on to talk about some of the ways that we engage with Parliament and with courts and all those disgusting systems, I'm just wondering if anyone has any thoughts or comments or questions about what we just talked about. No? Okay. Oh, yes.
I would love to hear in more detail how human trafficking is a colonial and racist idea, because I'm not really sure. I just want to...
Sure, yeah. So the question was more details on how human trafficking is a racist and colonial concept. So the first laws that reference human trafficking existed in the late 1800s in Canada, and they were specifically only about Indigenous women. So Indigenous women outside of permitted areas were considered to potentially be trafficked. And so it's a bit like drugs, right? It's the same time that they had drug laws that only apply to Indigenous people. Or if you're using drugs and you're Indigenous, then it's like a specific crime. And then over the next few decades, in the early 1900s, trafficking was mobilized specifically whenever there was some sort of racial panic. So the first big moment was when a lot of Asian women were coming to Canada. So Asian men were being brought to Canada to work and to build this country. And no one really wanted them to bring women along. And so they passed laws that, essentially assimilated most Asian women to sex workers. And that was a ground to deport them. So that was in order to, facilitate these camps of men that are working, but they're not starting families here. They're not going to have babies. They're not going to, plant roots in this country. So that's another moment that it was used. And then after that, there was this big panic around many different ethnicities, but this idea of protecting white women. So for a long time, the word human trafficking was actually replaced with white slavery in English, et la traite des blanches in French. So the idea behind that is that white women are pure and deserve, a white man to reproduce with, and should be the property of white men. But if these racialized men, whether they're black, Chinese, or like Eastern European, or like whatever it is at the moment, if they were to have sex with these women, maybe they would have babies, and maybe the white race would lose control of Canada. This was explicit language used at the time. It wasn't subtle or discreet. It's at the same time where they started criminalizing drugs with the same mindset of which drugs do black people use, which drugs do Asian people use. Are they using those drugs to lure those pure white women away from pure white womanhood? So that's where it comes from. Up until the 90s, white slavery was the term, right? It was the only term used. Up until the late 90s, where anti-immigration activists in many northern countries approached kind of these like anti-sex work, racist people, and were like, hey, can we maybe use this concept? And that's when we saw the rise of the concept of human trafficking being about cross-border problems, not necessarily sex work only, but any kind of, moving from country to country. And that's why we saw at some point, a lot of messages out there in the early 2000s about the difference between human trafficking and human smuggling, voluntary immigration versus like evil forced kidnapping immigration. And so a few years later, early 2000s, that's when prohibitionists, so prohibitionists are people who want to eradicate sex work, they came together all over the world. This is also pretty well documented. They had conferences and other, big meetings where they decided that human trafficking was a very useful tool to eradicate sex work, as long as all sex work is assimilated to trafficking. That if they can have a strong message that all sex work is trafficking or potential trafficking, it will counter any movement towards decriminalization. This is around the same time that New Zealand decriminalized sex work. And that was a really big deal. Prohibitionists were very afraid that it would have a ripple effect across the world, and they decided to come stronger with that message. In Quebec, instead of human trafficking, the word exploitation sexuelle, sexual exploitation, became the chosen term, because in Quebec, the panic, there was a perfect moment where there was some potentially underage girls that were caught doing sex work in Quebec City with black men around them. And so that really triggered this idea of most sex workers are underage, most are pimped by black men, and therefore the solution, and that's what we saw in Quebec City in the early 2000s, how this trafficking concept, like the deportation part and the anti-sex work part really came together, because all of the city, Quebec City in that time, was coming together to say, we need to protect our white teenagers from these black men, or black teenagers, and we should deport all of them, even if they're Canadian citizens, it doesn't matter. Everyone was obsessed. You could practically buy like little cards of each potential pimp that they would put the face in the media all day long. And so that was the big moment in Quebec for the prohibitionist movement. So they stuck with that, and that's why in Quebec, people really believe that like the average age of entry into sex work is 14 years old, which makes no sense, mathematically or socially. Versus in other parts of Canada, where there's other types of issues locally, So we know, for example, in Vancouver, there's a large Asian community and a lot of racist sentiment about that. So then they really went hard on Asian women are trafficked. We have to get rid of all of them, right? So it can be disassociated from that. In reality, yes, there are women who, maybe sex workers, who end up in a situation where someone is forcing them to work more than they want or against their will. And that's, violence, it's rape, it's, all kinds of other acts of violence. But calling it trafficking does not necessarily help, especially if the person was a sex worker before and will continue to be a sex worker after she gets out of that situation. Because when you call it trafficking, the only solution is to get her out of the sex industry, right? And there are also, very rarely, but it does happen, people who would be literally kidnapped to be forced to go work in the sex industry. But those cases are rare for a reason. And if we stop and think, about what sex work is, it's really hard to actually force someone to do that against their will. We are facing the public. We see clients. That's where we get the money from. There are many stories of women who were actually forced to work against their will. Within a day or two, they will be telling a client, I'm being forced to be here, help me. And generally, they will be rescued in that way. This whole narrative of any woman who disappears must be trafficked, any person who runs away must be trafficked, it only serves to really harm us. And we've heard before, right, in the panel before, two really, really horrific stories of violence against women by police and EMTs. And what they have in common is that in both of those situations, the women in question were considered victims in that situation. And so when the language of trafficking is used, we go from being the criminal to being the victim, but the violence and the control is the same. So sometimes there's an instinct, and we'll do it in our personal lives, right? If you get arrested and you're about to face really, intense criminal charges, and you have the option of crying and saying, I was trafficked, well, yeah, people will do that, and we obviously support anyone doing whatever they need to do to get out of those situations. But collectively, that victim narrative only serves as an excuse for more violence. That if we're seen as these deviant, evil women, then there's repression. And if we're seen as these helpless victims who are forced or too traumatized to know what we're doing, well, the solution is again to take away our rights and to put us in a different situation. Any other questions before we move on? No? Okay. So I want to give a bit of info about some activism that we do that is very institutional, very disgusting, very take a shower after you're done, way more degrading than any kind of sexual services we may provide, but very important. And a lot of us, maybe I'm the first to have that opinion personally as an individual. I never want to engage with Parliament. I never want to talk to the city. I never want to go to court. I never want to be in a courthouse. All of it is absolutely horrific. But when we come together collectively and we've created enough legitimacy that we are able to do these things, we have a responsibility to our community to do them. We can't just be oh, we're anarchists, fuck the government, and not talk to them. That's something people can do as individuals, but as collectives who are accountable, we owe it to our community to try and to see what we can do to change that system. So the first thing that we do is engage with Parliament. So regularly there will be committees that happen at Parliament that touch on issues that concern us. More rarely, but still pretty commonly, there will be bills that are being passed that we can comment on. And continuously, there's engagement with MPs and other government workers to have our perspectives put forward. And so in our experience, actually being visible in those moments does have a certain effect. It's not going to stop the system from doing what it's doing, but we can see that it might scale back some government initiatives. It might help stall some bills that were particularly problematic. And it creates a counter narrative to all of the hateful and dehumanizing things that are being said about us. And we see that that has some value, notably because it's important to some sex workers. So when we go and testify at Parliament and get yelled at by MPs about trafficking or whatever, most of the time we'll have sex workers contacting us after saying, I saw that and that made me feel a bit better. And that can be enough of an objective for us to do these things. So that we have these moments where we see that there is a resistance, that it exists, that we're not just passively allowing violence to happen against us. And a lot of times, the main effect, even if it doesn't create legislative change, it does help to change the language that is being used. The fact that the government now tends to use the word sex worker sometimes, they'll do really weird things with it, you know? But that's such a difference. In the 90s, prostitute was the only word they would ever use. And if we had done nothing in the past 25 years, victims of exploitation would be the only words that they would be using now. So being able to get this concept that sex work is work out in the government, it does have a certain protective effect on our community. We can't imagine how much worse it could be if we weren't doing this work. That's not a motivation. It's not like, no one can go to work thinking like, oh, maybe my work will prevent like things from getting so much worse. But when we're doing it collectively and we support each other to do this, it is, in our opinion, a worthwhile objective, and it's easy to do. Whenever there's a committee at Parliament, there's a clerk that's assigned to it. The email's on the website. All you need to do is send an email saying, I would like to testify, make your case as to why you're interesting or relevant, maybe contact an MP that's on the committee that's a bit friendly, and people do get in. Like, and we see who gets in to talk about, like, against us. Not long ago, I was at it was the Pornhub committee, and they had some country singer from Alberta who like went on a trip to like Thailand and heard about like sex work and thought that was horrible and created an initiative like not in my Alberta or whatever. And that guy got an hour to come talk to Parliament about why we needed to criminalize more sex work and ban porn or whatever. So people do get in. And so it's something that we can develop as a practice, that people who have that knowledge and capacity to know how to apply for this, to, just keeping up with all the committees on their website and seeing what topics are coming up, that's something that can be done, and that can make a difference. Obviously, if you get chosen, then you do need to like go and talk to these people. And that's something that requires some clear, written messaging and a clear idea of what your objective is when you're doing that. But it is something that maybe not everyone is conditioned to do that work of trying to get in. Then the other big thing that we do is fighting in court, also like horrific. So we have this premise in Canada called human rights, where the government has declared that the Charter of Human Rights is meant to be above everything else that is done in government. That Parliament cannot pass laws that go against it, and it's all very lofty and like beautiful if it were actually applied, right? If the Charter were actually a properly applied document that was alive and well, society would look very, very different. But in reality, what the Charter is just a series of legal tests and little maneuvers to work around it or to find a way to argue that maybe, So as sex workers who are literally being murdered because of laws, you can't just walk into court and say, I would like to not be murdered. Can you not have these laws? You have to play this really complicated game of submitting evidence, of making arguments that fit into all of these legal tests. And it's not easy. However, what we've seen in our community is that we actually are able to do that. We actually are able to educate ourselves on the law and on the processes behind it. We're able to develop legal arguments. We're able to develop evidence and to submit all of this. So that's what we're doing right now. We have a case from it's led by the Canadian Alliance for Sex Work Law Reform, which is an alliance that Stella coordinates and has groups from all over Canada that are primarily vying for sex workers. And so for us, we're really proud of this initiative because it's one of the only cases of that sort where we didn't just sign off, and let some lawyers go and run with the case. which is usually what's only offered to communities, right? These pro bono lawyers will come and say like, very interesting, I want to defend you, sign this piece of paper and I'll be back in 6 months with a full case and you'll get an outcome at some point. So what we decided to do was to take the time that we needed after the law changed last time, after we had won at the Supreme Court and the Parliament didn't listen to the Supreme Court. So we took the time to educate our groups all over Canada to learn about how this works. Then we decided when we were ready to move ahead with a case, and we decided collectively what we're actually going to put in there, what we will not put in there. And we saw in action how easy it is for our rights and our lives to be translated into like horrific garbage if we're not the ones writing it. I remember a first draft that we got from one of the lawyers that we worked with initially. We also have amazing lawyers. In this case, it was someone else who was drafting this. And so the first line of the proposed case was, "This is a case about consenting adults." And we were like, what? No, it's a case about people experiencing violence, about, all kinds of things. It's not some lofty, like, privileged escort who works independently case. It's a case for all of us. And so the fact that we were that involved in the process meant we were able to control it. So the case is still ongoing. We're at the Court of Appeal level right now. The case was on pause because there was a Supreme Court decision that was being rendered in another case. And so now we're going to be reactivating it, and hopefully we will win. But we know that whether we win or we lose, we didn't put anything out that we don't stand by. We didn't fuck over some of our community to maybe gain rights for part of it. We didn't do the thing where we're like, no offense to some of my colleagues, but we didn't do like some big compromise. Like we've seen, for example, for years with HIV, where we all oppose HIV criminalization, but there was a position put out there that we were against, criminalization of, like, unjust criminalization, and maybe intentional transmission could be criminalized. No, we're doing the opposite of that. We're saying, we are against all this criminalization, even the less palatable one, even the least likable sex worker, the violent one who's like just like the worst person, we still don't want her to be criminalized. And I think that there's so much power in organizing around these cases, and it's really hard to do. And it's something that in our experience, we want to encourage other communities to take control of these things, to look for actually qualified lawyers who are willing to listen. There are more and more of them, right? There's funding available to do constitutional challenges. So there are things that as individuals are very hard to imagine or consider, and unfortunately what ends up happening with a lot of these cases is that it is the individual who gets randomly arrested who ends up starting in their own defense these types of challenges. And so I encourage everyone in your own communities to consider if this is relevant to you, if there is room to fight against specific laws or policies in court, and to actually put some energy into finding out if that's possible or not. Sometimes it isn't, but when it is, I think it's something that we owe our community. We can't just go and do protests and scream against the government. We need to, get disgusting and get into the system and see what can happen if we crawl through it and come out of it alive. So that being said, there's some of that advocacy that we can do, and then there's some that we have to be really careful and mindful of, because when we're defending the rights of people who are criminalized, people are going to jail, people are getting deported, these consequences are real. And it's not always wise to put that out into the public because awareness of criminalization leads to more people calling the cops on us. And that's something that's very hard to do for activists who want to defend people, to know where the line is. For us at Stella, the line is defined by the women who use our services and who participate in our community. We're in touch directly with them. So we know that we can check in with them before using their stories. But a lot of times activism ends up separated from the service part, sometimes even within the same organization or in different organizations. And it's really hard to know, if you've witnessed a situation of violence in front of you, are you allowed to talk about it if you don't know the person and you don't have their consent? At Stella, we say no. We really don't. That really limits what we can say publicly, but it's important to us to have those limits. And then there's other things, we see horrific things that are happening in prison. And and we've tried, we've had mistakes that have happened where we tried to go public with some issues in prison, and then the women in prison get really punished for it. And we can't do that. No matter how horrific it is, no matter how we're really touched by the horrible violence that people are living. We hear stories of overdoses sometimes in our community where we're we see what the problem is and we want to say something or do something, but we know that the consequence of that will be too bad. So to know where to put those limits, I would really love to be able to do more education for sex workers on how to avoid all the money laundering risks and how to do crime and actually have money and not declare your income or things like that. But those are things that if we put too much information out there, people will be punished for it, and we're seeing that sometimes. When activist movements, come together and a lot of people join in, that there's not always this really conscious decision being made of what are we sharing and why and what is the limit as to what we're sharing. And so part of that, obviously, is that we don't want to use people instrumentalisés, right? It's really easy to do that by accident. It happens to a lot of women in our community who hear their stories being told by other people and don't feel good about that. And so that's really more important than anything else. If the person affected by the violence or by the repression is not interested, available, or willing to participate in the activism or give their okay for it, then we need to step back sometimes. That also means that we need to not give space to family and friends of people who've experienced violence. We see it a lot. With Indigenous women, it seems to be the most prominent situation where there's a genocide happening, women are going missing, women are being murdered, and when it was time for the inquiry to address this issue, almost all of the sex workers who tried to testify about violence against Indigenous sex workers were told no. Only one was allowed to go testify. And meanwhile, every relative who lost a family member, every mom who thought that her whore daughter was just total shame to the family, every family that kicked out their sex worker sister or cousin or whatever was giving this space. And we see it also when people die at the hands of police. That we just end up giving a lot of room to people who didn't experience that violence. So when we know that members of our community are being murdered, then the people we need to listen to are the other members of our community who somehow are still alive. We have that knowledge. So if we want to hear about murdered sex workers, why don't we talk to those of us who represent and who are women who've experienced maybe attempted murders, who've been dealing with protecting ourselves from murder. We can't just see that as two different communities, right? We're the same people. So that's it for me. I'm very interested in any discussion. Yes.
I'm just loud naturally. But yeah, as you were saying, for me, I have experience as I am an Indigenous sex worker and having to work in massage parlors and the fact that it is risky that you have to be in these places with no security and that you become your own security. I remember a situation that usually of us in a massage parlor happens around 3, 4 a.m. The clients come in and they're drunk. And I remember there was a situation where three guys come into a room and they're like, oh, we want to have one woman. And I was there I am not comfortable with that. I brought myself, for me, I didn't get along with them because of whatever stuff, but even if you don't get along with someone, you should still protect the people that you are surrounded by. And for me, it's just they tried to remove me from the room. They tried to intimidate me to leave the room. And I remember one of them actually took me by the throat and slammed me up against the wall, and because I have a particular accent, they tried being like, "Oh, you're not from here, are you?" And I'm like, "I have a native accent. I refuse to feel safe for that fact, that like the way of the cadence of how I speak." But I remember after months like me being like, "No, really, I refuse to leave this room," they left. 3 nights later, one of them came back and then entered because I would sleep in the laundry room for some sense of privacy. And then one night, the guy showed up and he went into the room, closed the light, locked the door behind him, and I'm in the dark with someone, and he just did that to scare me. And that moment where he can remember and come back, that to me was like, is my life in danger? That and like how much people, you can't tell anyone. You just have to be like, I have to accept my fate in this moment, in all of that. And to me, that still stands out. Like, it really got to me that was an experience. And we have to protect sex workers and vulnerable people. I was doing sex work to be able to cover the fact that I tried getting a job, I tried doing that, but because of my medical issues that would have me bleeding out constantly, I couldn't hold down a job. When I said earlier I lost a liter of blood, I lost that because of some of my moon time. I was fired the next morning for going to the hospital. And you're asking me to go get a regular job, they'll abandon me at any moment. So sex work kept me safe because I could pay my bills. And so I'm a proud Indigenous sex worker, and I refuse to feel safe, but we need to protect those around us.
Thank you for that. Is there any question or comment before we end? No? Great, right on time.